years experience in marine research and conservation. He is the founder and director of the Marine Research Foundation based in Sabah. He's also a past president of the Sea Turtle Society and a co-chair of the IUCN Marine Turtle Specialist Group. He's going to talk to us today about dugong conservation in a 21st century context and marine conservation in general. I think we all know the significance of marine conservation with a world that is 70% covered by the oceans and 50% of the ocean, or 50% of our species, our medicines, life itself being generated by those oceans. As for why Dilmah conservation, well, we believe that since in many cases business is perceived to be a part of the problem in relation to conservation, it also has tremendous potential to be a part of the solution. In that sense, our business is established on a unique philosophy that my father conceived of making business a matter of human service that is expressed since 1962 in a humanitarian context through the MJ Foundation, which is not involved here today, but since 1997 through the Dilmah conservation entity that is hosting you today. It's a very simple principle. Human welfare is so interrelated with the environment that the two are one and the same, and we are privileged today to welcome Dr. Pilcher, or Nick. In our discussions this morning, it was apparent to us that he is not only a learned marine conservationist and researcher, but he's also a very pragmatic one, and so I would not wish to take more of the time that we have assigned to you. Nick, may I invite you to the podium.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Dilmah Conservation and yourself and your father and Asanka, wherever you are in the back, for inviting me to Sri Lanka and to give me the opportunity to share some ideas with you tonight. We'll talk a little bit about dugongs. I presume that that's one of the main reasons you came here tonight. But I also would hope to share some thoughts on conservation, some thoughts on possibilities for the future, and some reflections on the past which might help us guide us in that direction. Just very briefly about myself, I have a very extensive background in marine turtles, and dugongs came to me very late in life. It was one of those big revelations. And what happened was I studied turtles, and I knew a lot about turtles. Probably still do, but I really knew a lot about them. I was the scientist of scientists, and the more I got involved with things, the more I started to realize that just knowing a lot about an animal wasn't doing anything about saving it. And there I was studying them, and every year there were less and less to study. And I started to realize that actually what was required was some form of conservation rather than just pure science for the sake of science. And so I've evolved. I think I study people more now than I study turtles. I figured out that wildlife management has a lot more to do with people managing the wildlife or managing their own activities, rather than me telling a turtle where it can lay eggs or a dugong where it should go and feed. As I was getting involved in all of this, I got quite tied down with the bycatch of sea turtles. Bycatch is very much when an animal swims into a net by accident. It's not on purpose. And the animal dies because it's an air-breathing reptile, can't come to the surface. And the more I got involved with that, the more I realized that in the same places where I was studying turtles and bycatch rays, there were all these dugongs as well. And they were seagrass feeding animals, and they long-lived, and they breathed air, and a lot of things. So dugongs, sea turtles, pretty much the same. And that's how I come to you tonight, speaking about dugongs. I wear a number of different hats, but one of the ones I do, and one of the main reasons I'm here tonight, is because I'm an advisor to the Memorandum of Understanding on Dugong Conservation, which is an international agreement which is set up under the auspices of the Convention on Migratory Species. The Secretariat is housed in Abu Dhabi, and They're entrusted with trying to promote conservation of dugongs throughout the range of dugongs, which, as we'll see in a little bit, is quite extensive. I came on board with them as an advisor, primarily in dealing with bycatch, and that's where we are tonight. Somehow I seem to have found myself in Sri Lanka, and this is my first trip. So, hands up, all of those of you who've seen a dugong. 1, 2, awesome, wow. Excellent, look at all these people. You guys too, that's amazing. All right, so I expected about nobody. They're not a very, very common animal. Right? There aren't very many of them left in Sri Lanka. And so I thought I'd just run you down, with the little life statistics, very much like a baseball card or a cricket card. So you've got the personal stats for the player, so many runs and wickets and overs and unders and ins and outs. You can tell I don't play cricket. But anyway, the dugong belongs to the order Sirenia. It's a Sirenia. Many people think that it's the origin of the legends behind the mermaid. When you see its photograph and you think about a mermaid, you sort of see a big disconnect. And I've never really got that. I figured people just saw the tail as it swam away and imagined the front. But because that's typically how you get to see a dugong, right? You're swimming away from it. So you see this beautiful tail and you just kind of imagine there's this beautiful half-naked lady in the front of it. That's sailor lore for you. But anyway, they're the only species within their family, and they are entirely marine herbivores. Their closest relative is the manatee. Some of you might have been to Florida, some of you might have heard of Florida, some of you might have even heard of a manatee. Very, very similar looking, but they migrate up into fresh waters for the periods when they're reproducing, and they feed up in fresh water, and they're not entirely marine. The dugong is the one animal that is entirely marine. It's a small little animal. At birth, it's only about this big, and it can grow up to about 4 meters, roughly about the length of this table. And I can tell you, I have jumped to catch one of those animals, and it's not a very clever thing. All right, so big animals, the adults are between 2.5 to 4 meters, and the calves are probably about this big. Really, really cute, really, really nice. They weigh in at an average of about 300 to 600 kilos. Those big ones like that, big 600 kilo animal, you jump on the back of that and it just flaps you around like a flag in the wind. And then you come back with bruised ribs and you name it. So not the cleverest thing to do. Typically, you'll find them, well, their range spreads around about 40 countries. But in most of those countries, the numbers are so low as to be nearly extinct. We're not there in Sri Lanka yet. Let's not go there. But I'll give you some ideas of range in a little bit. They typically live on seagrass beds. They're seagrass feeding. And so for the majority of their time, you'll find them in seagrass beds. Now, seagrass is very much like land grass, except for it grows underwater, and it requires sunlight. And so you don't get seagrass growing very, very deep, and you typically find dugongs in waters 10 meters and shallow. And in Sri Lanka, the northern part of the country, the northwest, sort of from Jaffna across and all the way over to India, that's a very, very shallow coastal area where there is extensive seagrass beds, and it's why dugongs have settled there and made it their home. Club affiliation, this one back to the whole cricket thing. The dugong was proudly joined the IUCN family as vulnerable back in 2002. Prior to that, it was data deficient. And vulnerable is not a really good thing. It basically means, if you translate it, it means it is vulnerable to extinction. And there is a strong likelihood of that happening in the coming 20 to 30 years. That's not a very nice position to be in. I also work with sea turtles, and we had one species that was endangered, and we brought it down to vulnerable, which was really good news, because it was really highly threatened before, and now we consider it to be less threatened. So the idea is that the dugong has to come out of the vulnerable range and go into something like near threatened. And that would be good news. But for that to happen, we have to start seeing conservation practices put into place and numbers start to come back. How we'll do that? We'll see that when we move on. They are quite long-lived. They're animals that live up to about 70 years old on average. And they take quite a long time to mature. If you can think of many organisms in the sea, and particularly fish, these fish reproduce, most fish reproduce nearly on an annual cycle. And fishermen get used to these things. But dugongs probably don't mature until they're 15, 17, 18 years old. And that means that it takes that many years of a dugong growing up and that many years of potential threats before they even get the opportunity to reproduce. Now, that's something that takes a lot of getting your head around when you're a fisherman and you deal with species that typically reproduce on an annual cycle. So that long period to maturation is quite a difficult thing. They then have very long pregnancies, right? Typically 12 to 15, 16 months. So quite a long pregnancy. And after they've given birth, it might be a number of years before they'll give birth again. It might be 2 years if the feeding quality is very, very good. But it might be 7, 8, or 10 years if the quality of the food around them is very poor. Everything is dependent on food. Food is really dependent on habitat quality and climate. And so you can see that there are more impacts than just fishermen. It's not just that, but we have to think about the quality of the seagrass beds, and we have to think about the impacts of climate and those sort of things. Now, we might not have a chance to have a direct impact on some of those, which is why we have to have a huge impact on the ones we can deal with. And that's, when you're talking about multiple threats all piling up, it's a case of dealing with the ones you can and really, really nailing it. All right? So that was that. And I thought I'd just talk a little bit about the habitats that they live in. Typically, seagrass beds, as I said, most of the time in waters shallower than 5 meters. So when we do really find dugongs, you can spend quite a bit of time with them. They're not deep, they're not far offshore, they're typically in quite shallow water. They typically concentrate their diet on 2 species or 2 families of seagrass. And these seagrasses are quite pioneer species. They're very high in fiber, and they grow very, very quickly. So when a dugong comes along and munches on seagrass, the seagrass that it's eaten can grow back very, very quickly. It's not like some very slow-growing plants that might take a long time to come back. So that's one of the big advantages for dugongs. Now, I say they typically spend their time in shallow water, but there have been records of dugongs feeding quite happily down at 40 meters. And that's really, really deep. And there are a couple of species of seagrass that will grow that deep if the water is very clear. The lights are going off at the back for those of you who want to nod off and go to sleep. So there are some species of seagrass that will grow in deeper waters, but only when the water is very clear. If you can think of turbid waters where the sunlight doesn't penetrate very far, you're not going to get seagrass down in depth.